Hey everybody, welcome back to Mixing Music Analog and mixingmusicanalog.com, and here on my YouTube channel. And in this video, once again, I'm here in my studio doing some experimentation, and I thought I'm going to turn on the camera and I'm going to show you what I'm doing here. So today what we're going to do is we are going to compare the API 5500 stereo hardware EQ, and we're going to compare that to both the Waves version plugin of that particular hardware, as well as the Universal Audio API plugin. Not exactly the same as the hardware, but I'll explain that in a minute, but close enough. So we're going to compare some hardware to some plugins. But before we get started, you like what you see, please subscribe, hit the notification bell. Also, if you like what I do here, please consider supporting the channel by hitting the thanks button below this video. And oh, by the way, go out to mixingmusicanalog.com. Check out what I have going on over there. You can learn all about my mixing services that I have, and coming very, very soon in the beginning of 2023, there will be some hybrid mixing training courses available to all of you. So make sure you check out mixingmusicanalog.com. So what do we have going on here? So this is what I have going on. So the API 5500 EQ, which you'll probably see an image come up on the screen shortly, that is a hardware EQ that I've bought about 6-8 months ago, and primarily I purchased it because I was in the middle of mixing an album for a band, and I really wanted something on my drum bus to really thicken up and really give that rock and roll, balls to the wall drum sound from an EQ perspective. I tried a bunch of things, transient designers, all kinds of things. Anyway, I settled on the API 5500 EQ. It's been strapped to my drum bus and I absolutely love it. It just brings a lot of low end, a lot of top end. It's punchy, it's thick sounding. I really, really like it. And I've been using it ever since. But I wanted to compare that to, well, what would that sound like without using the hardware, but using maybe some plugins on that same drum bus? How do they compare? So I thought this would be a good opportunity, to compare those things. So we're going to compare those today. So what we have going on here, just so you know what's going on, let's do the lay of the land here. So I have a drum kit here that's routed out to the console. We have a kick sample, snare top, snare bottom, sample, hats, toms, rack tom, floor tom, and some overheads. And that is all kind of balanced and EQ'd and panned appropriately. That is being routed down to a drum bus, and on that drum bus I have the API 5500 stereo EQ across that. There's no drum bus compression. There is no bus compression on the console. There's no SSL fusion. So basically we have the audio coming out of Studio One into the console, through the 5500, and then back into Studio One on a print track. So let me bring up Studio One here so you can see what we have going on here. So I printed that mix right back here in yellow. So you'll see it says API 5500 HW hardware. That is this drum part with the 5500. Then I duplicated that track. I bypassed the EQ, the hardware, right? Bypassed it so it wasn't being used anymore. And I ran that same musical part of the drums through on another track here. And on that track, we put the Waves 560B, which is this plugin right here. This is the plugin version of that, the stereo version of that. And we use the same exact settings, and I'll go over that in a second, what the settings are. Recorded that back in, duplicated the track again, this time printed it back in, no hardware EQ engaged. And this time we printed it, and then we put the Universal Audio API EQ. Now this is the Universal Audio 550A, which is the 3-band, where the 550B is the 4-band. The reason why I'm not using the 550B by Universal Audio is they don't make one. So I know this is not exactly apples to apples because there's one band that I'm not using, but I thought it would just be fun to throw it into the mix anyway, so keep that in mind. So you may be saying, well, what are the settings that you're using here? So this is what I did basically. So let me just move this over here, the Universal Audio, and I'll open up the Waves here. So on the hardware, this is exactly the way I have it set up. It's the same it's on the plugin here on the Waves plugins. At 50 Hertz, we're adding 4 dB as a bell. At 500 Hertz, we're taking out 2 dB. At 5K, I'm adding 2 dB. And then at 12.5K, we're adding 2 dB. That's exactly what's on the hardware, what's on this API, the Waves API. And on the waves, I turned on the little analog circuit because why not? Now on the universal audio, as I said, we don't have the mid-band. So the 500 hertz cut isn't in here because we don't have it. But I still added 2 dB at 12.5K, and I still added 2 dB at 5K, and then I added the 4 dB at 50 hertz. Again, it's not exactly the same EQ, obviously, but I thought it would just be fun to just see what the differences are. So I recorded those all back into Studio One. And then what we're going to do here is we're just going to solo between the yellow track, which is the hardware, the waves, which is the purple track, and the universal audio, which is the blue track. I level matched them all, and we're going to hear what the differences are, if there are any. And then maybe towards the end, I have a bass and a couple of heavy guitar tracks that we could just blend up so we could kind of hear it in context. So that's what we're going to do. Is there any real difference in sound between the hardware and the two plugins? So that's what we're going to do. Okay, so here we go. So let's start playing back. Here's the hardware. Just keep your eye on the solo button. That'll tell you which one you're listening to at that particular time. Okay, so we'll start with the hardware, and I'll go over to the waves, and I'll just kind of cycle through a little bit. Anything else to tell you? I don't think so. I think that's it. Here we go. Okay, so what I hear, and this is a lot closer than I thought it would be. I will say, in all the videos you've seen on this channel where we compare hardware to plugins, in compressors is where we've done most of the testing so far. And some of you guys have been asking us to do EQs, compare the SSL EQ to a plugin. We're going to do all of that. But whenever we've done a compressor, whenever I've done a compressor hardware to the compressor plugin, there was a pretty significant difference, and I've always liked the way the hardware sounded because of the 3D kind of a thing. It was obvious. To me, I'm convinced now, after doing enough of these tests with compressors, that the hardware compressors, in most cases, the plugins don't quite get there. EQ, on the other hand, this is a much closer thing than I would have suspected. What I do here in this example, and hopefully you're listening to this on good studio monitors or good headphones, is I hear there's more thickness in the bottom end of that kick drum on the hardware. The waves is really close, but it lacks a little bit of that low end. And the universal audio, because again, it's the 550, not the 550B, it's the A, not the B, we're missing the midband, and the design of it may be slightly different, is I hear that the snare and the openness of it is a little bit more than the hardware in the 550B, if that makes any sense. So tonally, it definitely sounds a little different, but again, I realize it's not the same exact EQ. But from a low-end perspective, I like the hardware just a little bit more. As far as listening to like the snare and the upper mids and the high end, they sound pretty almost identical. Let's listen to that again. Let's go back to the beginning. And let's listen to maybe the crack of the snare and just the tonality of the snare to see if there's really any difference, and try not to pay attention to the low end. So again, we'll start off with the hardware and then we'll move through the three. Here we go. Okay, just going between the hardware and the waves, sticking Universal Audio off to the side for a quick second here. They're really close. The snare is very, very close. I hear the hardware, again, seems to have a little bit more clarity to it. And again, we're talking minimal. We're talking minimal. We're not talking like, wow, there's a big difference. I think there's just a pretty significant difference in the low end, but in that snare, in that frequency range, I think it's very, very close. Just a little bit different, but really close. This 550 sounds really great. Let's keep listening now. Let's go between the hardware and the Universal Audio. I mean, way, way close. The snare, way, way, way close. But again, the low end is where the difference really is. Still really, really respectable. So now let's compare, let's go back, let's listen to that low end. I'd like to listen to the beginning of the very beginning of this loop. We have like 4 or 5 just kick drum hits here. If we can loop it right there, that might be a nice little loop. Let's loop it just right there. Just see if we could hear just those kicks, just to see. And the other place that I noticed it too, which we could put a loop there as well, is when he does those big tom rolls, boom, on that floor tom especially. I feel like the hardware's got more oomph to it. But let's confirm that. So here is just those kick drums in the beginning, and we'll cycle through and let's see if we hear any difference. Yeah, it's just a little bit underneath that real low kind of thickness. It seems like it's a little more focused. It's got a little more oomph to it. But again, we're talking, it's close, man. It's not that far off. Let's try the hardware to the Universal Audio on those same kick drum hits. Yeah, definitely to me, in the room here, it's level matched. What I hear is that that hardware has a little bit more toughness on the bottom. Again, it's not a whole lot. Let's find where that, I want to hear that big tom fill. I'd like to hear that again. Let me see if I can find it here. Right there. Okay, let's try that. We got that big tom fill there leading into it here. Let's start with the hardware, and I'll try to time it so we can go to the plugins just to see if what I think I hear is true. Yeah, I hear a little bit more toughness on the low ends. Let's keep going. Yeah, it's got a little bit more depth to it. So that is that's a quick little test here. I was just really curious to see how does again, now this API 5500 EQ, the stereo, the hardware, I mean, that's over $3,000. It's like $3,000, $3,200. It cost me a fortune. That's an expensive piece of equipment. I love it, don't get me wrong. But here's where you ask yourself the question, right? We're in a hybrid studio here. I mean, we're mixing mostly analog, but this is why, here, like I say before, I mix in the box and I mix analog. I do both. And, I'm not here. I'm trying to be as non-biased as possible to say, hey, what is the real sound differences, and kind of share it with you. This is so incredibly close that could you use this plugin as opposed to that $3,000 piece of hardware? You sure could. You absolutely could. Now, here's the last test we'll do. If I just boosted up that low end on the 550, because that's more apples to apples in the universal audio because it is a different EQ. So we'll take that one out of the mix and we'll just do the waves. So if I just put up another 2 dB on the waves, does that get us to the hardware? As far as, does that get us close or closer? Let's see. Maybe that's the difference. Let's try it. Here we go. No, not quite. I mean, it gets a little closer, but the hardware's got a little bit more focus. It's a little bit more focused than the plugin, but again, it's really close. And interestingly enough, now that I'm listening to the snare, I feel like the snare's a little bit more open on the hardware. Again, we're talking minimal amounts, man. And if you listen to the hi-hat feels like it's a little bit more up front, a little bit more, I don't want to say crispy's not the word, a little bit more clarity maybe. Listen to the hi-hat. It's really, really close. So, could you get away with this EQ as opposed to the $3,000 piece of hardware? Sure you could. Sure you could. Sure, you absolutely could. Now, from a signal flow and where would you place the EQ? So the signal flow is the same as when you're working with this. You got to consider the way everything is routed too, to make sure that you're getting that EQ in the signal path where you want it. And again, we're just testing this on a drum bus, obviously, because that's where I've been using it most often. But in upcoming videos over the next several weeks, I'm also going to put this maybe on a master bus, this API EQ on a full mix, just to see what that sounds like, maybe compare that to the EQ and do some more testing. Again, what I like to do here is I like to schedule in to my schedule. Part of my workload is I like to schedule, like, if I can, if I'm not really busy, you know, a week or 3 or 4 days a month, or a few half days a month where I can just sit down and experiment, where I'm not working on a project, where I can just get out and play, compare my hardware to my plugins, take my hardware, use it in different places. Recently, you probably watched the video. If you haven't, check the link in the description box or go check our archive where I did 4 different hardware compressors on a drum bus and just comparing the sound between them. I would typically always use one compressor, and I said, well, what would it sound like if I used these other 3? Just to try things and to experiment and to get to know your tools, because to me that is super important. We go out and we buy too much hardware, we buy too many plugins, we have all these tools, and we don't know how to use them all as well as we should. And some of this is experimentation and learning what works and what doesn't work to help develop your style as a mixer. So anyway, that is the API 5500 hardware EQ versus the Waves versus the Universal Audio. Let me know what you think down below in the description box. Which one did you like better? Did you hear much of a difference? Do you use these particular plugins? Do you use anything for hardware as far as a stereo EQ? I'd like to know what you think below. Let me know. So make sure you do all of that. Make sure, once again, you like, share, and subscribe. And again, if these videos help you in any way, consider supporting the channel by hitting the thanks button. It really does help me, and I want to say thank you in advance for doing that, because a lot of you have done that on prior videos, and I really do appreciate it. It allows me to do these kinds of videos for you and take time out of my busy day to kind of bring this information to you, so I do appreciate it. Also, last but not least, go out to mixingmusicanalog.com. Check it frequently, because as I said, beyond my mixing services that I have on that website, there will be some training courses coming up in the beginning of 2023. And if you're watching this in the future, go check the website, because those courses are already going to be there, where we're going to have some pretty in-depth courses on mixing different styles of music in the analog hybrid workflow, from rock to pop to country to jazz and so much more. So once again, I've been Dave with Mixing Music Analog and mixingmusicanalog.com. Thank you so very much for watching me today, and I'll see you guys in the next video.